We have two books of Mr. Khodorkovsky here. Here is Bitter Choices, Loyalty and Betrayal in the Russian Conquest of the North Caucasus. And Michael Khodorkovsky, sorry. Gorky Wybor of Russisch. I am irritated. I don't know which language I should speak actually. So it's the same book in Russian, but Gorky Wybor, Bitter Choices. Yes, of course. So the topic of Mr. Khodorkovsky's input, or how we call it, Beitrag, wie ist auf Englisch? Contribution, yeah. About the colonial regime of the Russian Empire, Georgia, as an example. The floor is yours. Thank you.
So there's a difference between contribution and retribution, I want you to know. Okay, so I'm sorry to impose English on you. Everyone so far heard German, but I think it'll be easier, certainly for me, to deliver this in English. So this paper, what I'm trying to do in this paper is to raise several issues. One is to suggest and argue that Russia was a colonial empire. The second is to ask why is it that a Russian empire actually never considered itself to be a colonial empire like other empires in Europe. And the third broader question is to try to place Russian Empire in the context of other empires. So I'll talk in general about these issues, and then we'll give a specific case of Georgia. Since I'm in Georgia, I should say something about Georgia. And that will be the paper. So what I'm trying to do is to recover the traces of the colonial discourse in Russian imperial historiography, and place the history of Russian expansion in the south and east, that is in Asian parts of the Russian Empire, in a colonial framework usually reserved for the West European empires. Russia's expansion, I argue, into the regions populated by various non-Christian peoples presented Russia with a similar set of colonial challenges that were confronted by the European powers. But in contrast to most of the European colonial experiences, in autocratic Russia, it was the state that first and foremost managed the colonial affairs, while at the same time denying the empire's colonial nature. If one considers that European colonial empires evolved from ones largely reliant on their commercial, private arms to ones mostly administered by the state, Russia's state colonialism from this vantage point preceded the European one. How is my English? Is it too... do I speak too quickly? No. Okay, good. This vision of the Russian Empire stands in sharp contrast to the traditional image of Russia as a backward empire, lagging behind its more developed Western European neighbors, which has long been a standard of Western historiography. Indeed, in numerous activities that could measure a nation's level of development, commercial, scientific, economic, military, educational, and civic, Russia always struggled to catch up with the West. Since the early 19th century, the thesis of Russian backwardness came to play a critical role in Russia's perception of itself and its relationship to the rest of the world. Yet, if modernity of the modern state is defined in terms of institutional structures capable of conveying the authority from the center to a distant periphery, and this is a Weberian definition, then the Russian government was more modern than the governments of most European empires. This Weberian definition of modern might be a subject to debate, and Russia's exclusive reliance on the state in governing its sprawling colonial empire is not a subject to debate. In fact, there was an unprecedented role of the state that distinguished the Russian Empire from its European counterparts. During the mid-16th century, Moscow's rapid expansion into the regions of the mid-Volga and Siberia, with their animist and Muslim population, transformed Moscow from the insignificant principality into one of the first early modern empires. At the same time, as the Muscovite state was expanding eastward, the Spanish Empire was increasing its possessions in the New World. Later, the Spanish imperial conquests would be characterized as colonial, while the post-16th century Muscovy is neither referred to as an empire, nor its conquest and rule over a large non-Christian population are commonly considered colonial. How does one explain such a conceptual difference? Traditional views hold that Russia was different from the European overseas empires because it expanded into the contiguous territories, with the exception of the short-lived American colonies. And so, therefore, Russia is considered a continental empire. I suggest that beginning from the mid-16th century, Russia was both a continental and a colonial empire. The undoing of the rigid classification of Russia as a continental empire helps to consider Russian historical experience alongside European overseas empires. And so we'll consider here how the myth of the Russian Empire came into existence and why, throughout the centuries, the imperial government officials and Russian historians consistently refused to see Russia as a colonial empire. I will skip a long historiographical section here, and I will just summarize it by saying that essentially Russian historians throughout the 19th century and early 20th century developed an idea of Russia's imperial Sonderweg. We can use it appropriately here. Pogodin, for example, Russian historian Pogodin was a classical example of this kind of approach. He said, in the West, he said, there were conquests, and there were brutal conquests like the Spanish conquest of Americas, and they oppressed the native population. Hernan Cortés, he gave as an example. But we in Russia never had this. Our conquest was actually always peaceful, said Pogodin. We brought civilization to other people. And Yermak, the conquest of Siberia, he compared Yermak with Cortés, Siberia and Spain. He said Yermak, of course, the conquest of Siberia is far greater, obviously, than the Cortés's conquest of Mexico. So I'll just read it a little here. But if the Russians observed the obvious parallels between the Russian conquest of Siberia and the Spanish conquest of the Americas, they also noticed how a series of wars of independence ended the Spanish rule in the Americas and brought about the sovereign states of Latin America. If Russia's conquest of Siberia was similar, would the Russian Empire follow the same path? Ara said, that's one of the few words I learned so far. Nor argued Pogodin that this was where Russian experience diverged from the West. And so I told you that, Russia was special, and its special sort of Slavic Sonderweg is what separates Russia from the West. So the contradictions, multiple contradictions, were apparent. In reality, the Russian Empire included colonial regions and peoples which the government considered an integral part of the empire. To the Russian government officials, however, it seemed that the colonial empires were only the ones embodied by the European empires and their overseas possessions. In his proposal, submitted to the Senate in the 1760s, a Russian general and senator, Muravyov, advocated the expansion of Russia's commercial interests. To do so, he argued, Russia had to become a colonial empire like its European counterparts. With great admiration, Muravyov described the sweat and sacrifices of the Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch in establishing their colonies in the East. But the Russian Empire was already in Asia, he insisted, and therefore creating colonies there and expanding commerce the way Europeans did was only natural. And this quote about Muravyov, in fact, I owed to Guido Hausmann, who found it in the library, right? In the manuscript collection of the library. How best to exploit and administer their colonies was on the mind of many European officials in the 1760s. Ironically, while the Spanish government considered how to transform its colonies into a model of the British commercial empire, the British were increasingly attracted to a centrally controlled empire on the model of the Spanish. Lord Halifax, the president of the Board of Trade between 1748 and 1761, presented successive administrations with the far-reaching colonial administrative reforms that would enable London to create a cost-effective empire. Madrid, on the other hand, wanted to transform Spain's American possessions into British-style colonies. Only in the 19th century did various Russian officials begin to cautiously voice suggestions that the term colony could be applied to certain parts of the Russian Empire. For example, the Russian finance minister, Yegor Konkrin, whose real name, of course, was Georg von Konkrin, a good Baltic German. Was he Baltic German or German? I'm not sure. Baltic German. Huh? Yeah, so not Baltic German, yeah. So Konkrin argued in the 1820s that Georgia should be treated as an economic colony. Likewise, some 19th century Siberian intellectuals and administrators insisted that Siberia was a Russian colony. Without denying the Russian roots of the Siberians, this Siberian separatism promoted the idea of the self-governing Siberian nation similar to Britain's Australian colonies. Why not? At the same time, both Siberia and Australia had much in common as the penal colonies of their empires. Of course, the shipments of convicts to Australia stopped in the 1860s, while Siberia continued to be the dumping ground for criminals and politically undesirables until the end of the 20th century. But the most prominent voices advocating the existence of a colony in the Russian Empire came from Russian officials familiar with the state of affairs in the recently conquered Central Asian territories. In the early 1870s, the Russian Governor-General in Central Asia, Konstantin von Kaufmann, all these Germans everywhere, as you see, compared the Russian Turkestan with the British India and concluded that Russian Turkestan too should be designated a colony. A generation later, the Russian senator, Count Konstantinovich, guess his name is, von der Pahlen, dispatched from St. Petersburg in 1908 to review and write a comprehensive report of the region, similarly argued that Turkestan was a quote-unquote a colony within the empire. A few years later, the government of Turkestan, General Kuropatkin, that's the first Russian name we come across, argued likewise. Yet in all cases, the response from Petersburg was the same. The Russian Empire had no colonies. This persistent denial of any hint of colonial character of the Russian Empire did not prevent some government officials from engaging in occasional comparisons between the Russian imperial experience and those of the British in India or French in Algeria. In 1842, the supreme commander of the Russian troops in the Caucasus, Golovin, and the war minister Chernyshov both suggested to the emperor that the British and French experiences might be usefully applied to the Caucasus, but they didn't specify how. The report finally submitted by Chernyshov in 1848 examined some of the French policies in Algeria and cautiously concluded that while the French government of Algeria was naturally very different from Russia's, the French policies should be made known to the Russian policy makers in the region. This was a fine middle line between learning from the colonial experiences of others while denying the colonial nature of the Russian Empire. At the same time as officials in Petersburg refused to consider a notion of colony within the Russian Empire, they continued to rule over numerous non-Christian peoples and regions through the various arms of the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs or the War Ministry. For example, throughout the 19th century, the empire's Asian territories were administered by the Asiatic Department, founded by the Imperial Decree of April 19, 1819, as a part of the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs. The department was charged with dealing in, quote, matters related to Asia and the Oriental non-Christian population, unquote. So in other words, while technically Russia claimed Central Asia as being part of the Russian Empire, which you would assume, therefore, should be integrated in some basic structures, or at least attempted to be integrated, in reality, it was run by the Special Department of the Foreign Ministry, which deals with non-Russian, non-otherwise entities outside of Russia. So this contradiction, as many others, were quite apparent. The French, too, among other European powers, ruled Tunisia and Morocco through the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, but with the exception of Algeria, which was considered to be the integral part of France, Paris regarded its North African territories as protectorates and ruled them as such. Russia, by contrast, made no distinction between colonies and protectorates and considered all conquered lands as an integral part of the Russian Empire. No wonder that denying the existence of colonies, Russia, of course, had to deny the existence of the colonial institutions as well. The Asiatic Department, in reality, was similar to the colonial institutions of other European empires, which throughout the second half of the 19th century consolidated various colonial functions previously dispersed among several government departments into national colonial offices. For example, the British Colonial Office, the French, le Ministère des Colonies, the Spanish Despacho Universal de Indias, or the German Kolonialamt. Prior to the emergence of the colonial departments, most colonial functions were given to the departments of Navy and War in Britain and France, and the Council of the Indies in Spain. The German example offers the closest parallel, where the colonial affairs were also run by the colonial department, Kolonialabteilung, within the German Foreign Office, Auswärtiges Amt, until it became separated into the Reichskolonialamt in 1907. The absence of clearly defined colonial institutions in Russia was in some ways similar to the dispersal of the foreign and colonial administrative functions among Russia's imperial neighbors in Asia. Like Russia, the Qin China too considered all conquered territories as an integral part of its empire, and communicated and ruled the frontier regions through multiple means: the civil and military bureaucracy, individual officials communicating in secret code directly with the court, and the office of Lifan Yuan in charge of relations with Mongolia, Tibet, and parts of southern China. The Ministry of the Foreign Affairs formally appeared in China for the first time in 1901. Likewise, the Ottoman Empire lacked any official office in charge of the foreign matters until the 19th century. While Reis-ul-Kitab, literally the chief scribe, was the head clerk of the imperial council, de facto presided over the Ottoman relations with foreign powers, the government did not formally recognize his foreign affairs responsibilities until 1792. After the establishment of the Ottoman Foreign Ministry in 1836, the position of Reis-ul-Kitab was finally given a new title of a foreign minister. Hariciye Naziri is the Turkish title. Thus, it was only with the establishment of the Western-style foreign ministries that the Qin and Ottomans would borrow and apply to their own experiences the Western concept of an empire, a civilizing mission, and, by implication, a colony. The Russian Empire faced similar dilemmas as other European empires in controlling and governing the territories populated by the non-Christians, and I can add later that should include also Georgia, even though it was a Christian country. From early on, however, Russia chose a different approach. Some Western European empires relied on the privately financed companies to administer the colonies. The British and Dutch East India companies operated in Asia, or the Hudson Bay Company in North America, just to mention a few. Others, like the Spanish or Portuguese, relied on a combination of state, church, and private governance. By contrast, St. Petersburg put faith solely in the state administration of the new territories. The only exceptions were the short-lived charters given to the Stroganov's brothers to explore Siberia in the 1560s, and to the Russian-American Company in Alaska, which was founded in 1799 as the first joint stock company in Russia, to survive for 2 decades before being disbanded and put under the government control. So these 2 charter examples of receiving a charters survived for only 2 decades. In short, while the colonial rule of most European empires evolved from the one administered by the private companies to the one placed under the control of the state in the 19th century, Moscow, similar to its imperial counterparts in Istanbul and Beijing, placed its colonies under a firm government control from the 16th century onward. So let me now skip to the example of Georgia, the case that became known as the Griboyedov Project. Has anyone heard of the Griboyedov Project here? Aha. Okay, so that's, for some people it's not new, but maybe I'll have to repeat it again. So one particular case provides some valuable insights into the mentality of the Russian authorities. Alexander Griboyedov, a well-known Russian poet and diplomat, began his diplomatic career in the Asiatic department that I mentioned in 1822 and was stationed in the Caucasus. His knowledge of the local languages and culture, familiarity with the region, and his marriage into the Georgian nobility led him to idea of founding the Russian Transcaucasian Company. In 1828, Griboyedov, together with Zavaleyski, a Russian treasurer in Georgia, submitted a project to the Supreme Commander in the Caucasus, General Ivan Paskevich. The idea was simple: create a commercial joint stock company to develop silk, woolen, and wine industries, or more generally, quote, use the natural resources of the region to raise the knowledge and well-being of the region and thus benefit the state, unquote. Before being considered by Paskevich, the project had to be scrutinized by the official referee, who was General Zhukovsky. The surviving document, Griboyedov's proposal and their specific criticism by Zhukovsky, captures both sides of the debate about Russian Empire and colonialism in the 19th century. Griboyedov suggested giving the new company special privileges and modeled after the British East India Company. His critic rejected the comparison, insisting that Georgia and other provinces of the Caucasus were, quote, parts of the Russian body, unquote, and therefore no special privileges were necessary. Zhukovsky noted further that had England been strong enough at the time of its early conquest, it too would have dispensed with the East India Company. It would not have needed East India Company. So because England was weak, it didn't do what Russia did to Georgia. To Griboyedov's suggestion that the proposed Transcaucasian Company could increase fivefold the revenues of the region, 5 times it could increase the revenue of the region, also angered his critic, who replied dramatically, "Is it not an insult to think that great sacrifices in blood and treasure were made for some kind of revenue or sugar plantations?" Unquote. Instead, he continued, the Russian sacrifices were made for a far greater purpose, quote, so that the conquest of the hostile peoples removes the danger from the heart of Russia, unquote. Griboyedov envisioned the company helping to civilize the region and bringing the local peoples closer to Russia through moral ties. Not so, replied his critic, and asked rhetorically, quote, is it true that a private company is better able to govern and educate the people than the government? This is a denigration of the government, unquote. Predictably, Griboyedov's other proposals were likewise rejected by his critic. That the company should have its own peasants, administer its own territories, and give the Porto Franco, free port, status to Batumi. Once again, Zhukovsky's objections were reduced to one central argument. The existence of the company would disadvantage the Russian state, which in his view was perfectly capable of achieving the same objectives. In so many ways, the clash between the ideas of Griboyedov and Zhukovsky was a classic Russian exchange between the liberals and conservatives, the westernizers and nationalists, the civilian proponents of the commercial interests and Russia's peaceful civilizing mission on the one hand, and the military's uncompromising vision of the state interests on the other hand. Consequently, both sides sought to integrate the region into the Russian Empire, but by different means. Griboyedov's vision was of a slow and humane integration through encouragement of trade and industries, supervised by a non-governmental body, granting the region limited autonomy and privileges, and winning over the indigenous people through patience and perseverance. Zhukovsky's vision was a state colonization project demanding expedient integration of the local population into the imperial body, fearful of change and intolerant of any challenge to the government authority. Neither Griboyedov nor Zhukovsky had a chance to debate their views. This was Russia. Instead, theirs was a typical internal governmental exchange of opinions produced for the benefit and consideration of more senior officials. In this case, the Supreme Commander in the Caucasus, General Paskevich, who reviewed the proposal and its criticism and rejected Griboyedov's project. The reasoning behind Paskevich's decision became clear only 2 years later, when in response to the proposal by the finance minister Kankrin to introduce the industries in Georgia, Paskevich wrote, quote, "Should we not treat Georgia as a colony which would supply the raw materials, silk, cotton, etc., for our factories and receive manufactured goods from Russia? Otherwise, would not the establishment of the manufacturing in Georgia naturally lead to the weakening of Georgia's mutual ties with Russia?" Unquote. In other words, privately chartered companies were unnecessary to develop the regional economy so that Georgia does not become economically and politically independent. Instead, Georgia was to be a classic colony administered by the Russian state. So I will not tax your long patience any longer. I will simply skip to the conclusions. Anyone who is interested in learning more about this subject, I'll be happy to send you this. It was published in an article, so I'll be happy to send it to you. But let me just summarize it in a few other parts. One of the problems was that in Asian parts of the Russian Empire, the imperial frontiers were amorphous and fluid. They did not always coincide with administrative borders of the state. The imperial frontiers evolved into the stable borders only when Russia reached the borders of other sovereign empires and states, such as the Ottomans in the Caucasus, Iran, and the British Empire in Central Asia, and the Qin China in southern Siberia and the Far East. No less difficult was it to draw a distinction between a metropolis and periphery. Of course, such a border was a subjective product of the Russian mentality and kept moving further away from the center. By the early 19th century, the mid-Volga region, colonized for centuries by the Slavic settlers, was now seen as an inseparable part of the Russian metropolis. Likewise, the Northwest Caucasus, whose population of the indigenous Adige peoples was forcefully resettled or deported between 1860 and 1880, by the early 20th century was seen as a true Russian region belonging to the Kuban Cossacks. In 1914, on the eve of World War I, the government official publication called Asiatic Russia proclaimed that, quote, "The lands of Asiatic Russia are an indivisible and inseparable part of our state, and at the same time, our only colony," unquote. Nothing illustrated better the cognitive dissonance of the Russian Empire than this statement. After centuries of denial and prevarications, the Russian officials readily admitted that Russia was a colonial empire and that its territories in Asia constituted such a colony. Yet these colonial lands and peoples remained an indivisible part of Russia. Russia's persistent contradiction between a colonial empire and a unitary state has never been resolved. 5 years after the imperial government was swept away by the revolutions of 1917 the Bolsheviks offered their own radical solution by reconstituting the former empire as a new polity, the USSR. The Bolsheviks admitted the colonial nature of the Russian Empire, condemned it as a prison of the peoples, and promised the non-Russian peoples equal status within the new socialist union. By the late 1930s, the revolutionary approach towards resolving the old interethnic and national rivalries was disappearing. After World War II, the official references to the Imperial Russia as a colonial empire were dropped. Instead, the authorities emphasized a historical role of the Russians in civilizing the empire's non-Russian peoples. Thereafter, until the collapse of the USSR in 1991, Moscow ignored any notion that Russia was a colonial empire and that, like many other empires, it too was forged in blood. Instead, the Soviet ideological machine produced an image of the Russian Empire's benevolent rule over the numerous non-Russian peoples who chose to submit to Russia voluntarily. Thus, it was only natural that the Soviet ideologists maintained this idea of eternal friendship of the peoples, which provided for they maintained the perfect union in the USSR. But as we found out in 1991, the union proved less than perfect, and the Soviet Union peacefully dissolved along the multiple national and ethnic lines. Finally, unshackled from the Soviet dogmas, the colonial historiography grew rapidly in the post-Soviet space in the last decade of the 20th century. But almost immediately after Mr. Putin assumed the presidency in 2000, this line of questioning began to wither, to disappear, replaced by the old Soviet canards about the friendship of the peoples, this time in one united Russia. More recently, in a continuous search for an ideology to fit the present-day Russia, the Kremlin resurrected the idea of Eurasianism. And I will skip a little discussion of Eurasianism here, but I'll just emphasize that today a refurbished Eurasianism serves the Kremlin to promote its own nationalist and anti-Western agenda, to tear Russia away from Europe's liberal democratic traditions, to resurrect Russia's presumed greatness, and to pave the way again for Russia's Sonderweg. And in conclusions, I'll just say that what I tried to do here is to re-examine Russia's imperial heritage, to place it into a wider European perspective, and to show that both in theory and practice, Russia was a colonial empire. I argued that Russia's conquest and rule over the vast Asian territories and their non-Christian population represented a form of European colonialism, that Russia practiced a state colonialism from the outset, and that Russia's statist form of colonialism preceded most of the European colonial empires, which evolved from intergovernment-run systems later in the 19th century. Yet, in contrast to the European colonial powers, the Russian imperial authorities consistently refused to identify their empire as colonial. In this sense, Russia's imperial rulers were more akin to their counterparts in Asia, the Ottomans, the Safavids and Qajars in Persia, and the Qin in China. While all these empires ruled over a large and heterogeneous population within their domains, they did not conceive of themselves as colonial empires. The term colonial was reserved for the European empires alone. Russian Tsars saw themselves as universal rulers with an autocratic power over each and every being within the imperial domain. Recognizing colonial territories, by definition, implied a different status within the empire a form of self-rule and decentralization that could lead away from the state control and thus was unacceptable to the authorities. And because Russia's expansion throughout the centuries was fundamentally driven by geopolitical objectives, just like today, occasional arguments by Russian officials in favor of a colony as a more efficient commercial enterprise were routinely dismissed. Unlike the rapid colonization of the New World by the European settlers or China's borderlands by the Han Chinese, Russia could never escape a daunting demographic challenge. Given the size of the empire, the East Slavic population was simply insufficient to settle and achieve a demographic dominance in the non-Slavic regions, particularly those with large numbers of Muslims. As a result, the imperial policies once again were riddled with ambiguities. While formally relying on the settler model of colonialism, the Russian government faced an incongruous reality on the ground. The Russian Empire was a diverse, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious political body with large colonial populations. Such an empire demanded complex political, social, and legal mechanisms that were not easily reconciled with the streamlining and homogenizing tendencies of an autocratic police state. Herein lies a historic paradox and dilemma of Russia as a nation-state and a colonial empire. Understanding the colonial nature of the Russian Empire and the kind of state colonialism that it practiced provides new insights into both Russia's past experiences and its present ambitions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Michael, so I will have a question as a historian. Thank you very much for your attempt to reconceptualize Russian history as imperial history. I was wondering, you are giving a quote from Pagodin. Why didn't you quote Kluchevsky from his introduction to his course Ruskoy Story, where he said the history of Russia is a history of a state that colonized itself. So in a sense, it is your presentation in a nutshell, yeah, from a historian's view, but he was a liberal historian, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. That is true. This is a different issue, though. I think he emphasized he meant a different thing from what I'm talking about. This is, what he mentioned was picked up, I think, more by a more recent book by Etkind. What's the exact title? But anyway, his main idea of self-colonization. And I completely disagree with that. I don't think that applies at all. For a number of complicated arguments or reasons. It's not... One of them, let's say, let's put it this way. You cannot, first of all, you have to begin with the definition, what is colonial? And I have a chapter on this. I didn't, of course, want to read all of this. So you need to define what is a colony, because the imperial policies could be simply imperial, but they also could be colonial. Just let me give you a quick example. Let's say Napoleon's wars in Europe. When Napoleon invades Spain and Germany, we wouldn't call it a colonial war against Germany, right? But then somehow French troops cross Mediterranean and land in Egypt, and this becomes a colonial conquest. So what makes it colonial? Is it just the fact that he crossed the body of water? No, I argue not, of course not. What makes it colonial is a disparity between different civilizations, cultures, religions, that has to be perceptions of superiority and inferiority in terms of cultures and civilizations and so on. And something dramatically different. So in Russia, when I talk about various non-Christians people, we find that Georgia is actually a very interesting example because it does fit into, I wouldn't call Ukraine as a colony of or Poland as a colony of Russian Empire. But the eastern, southern, and eastern territories do fit into this. And Georgia, curiously, despite the fact that it's Christian, I think fits into it, because actually the Russian emperors treated Georgia formally in the same way they treated various non-Christian peoples and Central Asia and so on. Very different from the way they treated various states and organized societies in the West. From this point of view, and Etkin argued that Russia basically colonized itself in the sense that peasants were also a foreign body within Russia, and they were colonized by the elites and so on. And so I would suggest that that is completely different. You would not call it a colonial, you know. In this case, Britain was colonizing itself too. I mean, the English peasants were very different from, you know, English nobility, and that's not the case. That's just one of the counter arguments. So I think, to answer your question, that's what Kluchevsky meant, and I think that was picked up by Etkind, but I argue a different case. I'm talking about colonial nature vis-a-vis mostly the non-Christian peoples of the Russian Empire.
So you pointed several times to Germans. To Germans.
Germans, yes.
In Russia's civil service, you know, and we know there are plenty of them in the military service and, you know, in high offices and in the civil service. So my question would be, is there anything particularly about the Germans that they wanted to be part of a colonial empire more than others? You know, something. One could raise this question, you know, because they were looking at the German Kaiserreich, or you know, for whatever reason.
One could and one should raise this question, absolutely. On a simple level, I think what we see they are very well educated. They bring wisdom, knowledge, and ideas that Russians did not have. I mean, you know probably better than I that all the sciences and academies and the academic institutions were founded by the Germans, right? From the beginning, from the late 18th century. Not the French and not the English. It's the Germans who founded it. But I always like to put it on a more general way. I like this, I like the way I put it. Not very modest. I think it was a perfect marriage between Germany and Russia. For Germans, Russia presented this enormous exploratory field, right? So they didn't travel overseas the way the British, the French, and others did. The Germans went this way. So Russia was, for them, is this huge colonial space that they could explore, run, govern, and describe, like Miller, dozens of Germans running around, you know, taking notes, describing peoples, describing flora and fauna, founding the chairs of in various fields. So it was a perfect marriage between application of German knowledge to a place which could not do it itself, it seems to me.
But because you were hinting at the Baltic German nobility that played such a pivotal role in the colonization of Central Asia and so on, it might also be the setting of this German Baltic nobility in the Baltics as a leading, as the elite with Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, so peasants of a different ethnic background. But this might be that they were so in terms of certain style of governance or something like that.
Yeah, of course they were the elite in the region where they were, and once they're conquered by Russia, they were never really entrenched in the region, right? They lived in the very sort of separated style. They had nothing to do with Lithuanian peasants. So they would be, whether they would be ruling in their region in the Baltics, or they would be having estates in Ukraine or in Central Russia, or doing administrative work in the regions or in Petersburg. I mean, they were this mobile, I mean, this is not much that I know much about, but they were mobile elite. Some people suggested, like my colleague Yuri Sloskin, who writes about the Soviet Union, and he suggested, I think correctly, that basically in the 20th century, you take the Germans out, the Baltic Germans out, and you replace them with the Jews. Because the Jews become that elite in the 1920s, 30s Soviet Union. It may be slightly an exaggeration, but I think there is something to it. So they were just this mobile elite, of course, coming to power for different reasons than the Jews. The Jews find a way up the ladder after the Bolsheviks liberate them from the pale of settlement they have to live. And I mean, this is really upscale mobility. For the Baltic Germans, it simply was also an upscale mobility, but an application of their skills, knowledge, status, and so on, yeah.
Some more questions, maybe? No? Everybody's tired.
So you elaborated on the project by Alexander Griboyedov. There was also another one in the 1840s, early 1840s, by Paul Hahn. And then, of course, the introduction, the replacement of governors general to introduce a viceroyship in 1848, and introducing Mikhail Vorontsov, who grew up in Britain and very much into those elements of colonial governance, trying to get to win the local elites over, solving the problems with the resistance of the local nobility and so on. So what do you think about that?
Well, what is interesting, of course, that depending on who governed the region, and ethnicity had a role, I think, here in education, you could see different styles. Vorontsov, because he was educated and lived in England for a long time, brought very liberal ideas with him, much more tolerant and so on. Baltic Germans were not known for that, I'm sorry to say. They were actually a much more authoritarian, tougher rulers, not exactly tolerant of not having these ideas of let's go slower, but try to include, they all had the same goal, of course, to incorporate the new regions and peoples into the empire. The question is how you do it. So the military and Baltic Germans often were on the tougher side, conservative side, maybe we can call it, always advocated tough policies and quicker integration. People like Vorontsov, or in the North Caucasus, I forgot his name, but I mentioned this in the book also. He was a famous Decembrist, also liberal thinker. They suggested, let's integrate them through trade. Let's create free zones. Let's, educate them slowly. And in those cases, when they are not Christians, let's slowly convert them to Christianity. So the purpose was the same. The question is how you do it, whether you do it by force quickly. It's like after the Soviet Union collapse, after the Wende, the question was, how do you transform East European regimes? You do it quickly, the way it was done in Poland, and therefore painfully, or you do it slowly, or you don't do it at all, like in Russia. Well, it's a joke. So there was a difference, and Vorontsov was clearly very different on a much more liberal, tolerant, expansive side. And this kind of we can see this in Russian history all the time. Yermolov, General Yermolov, known for this Padishah of the Caucasus, who openly said, I want the locals to use my name to scare their children. right? He made no qualms about it. He wanted to terrorize the people. But then it became too much. It became clear that he actually antagonized a lot of people, that it creates the opposite effect. So he's been replaced by more moderate commanders who try something else. So in Russia, there are always two tendencies. Some are more between the staff commanders and more tolerant ones. And the tolerants are there. And they sometimes have their policies. The problem is they never prevail. It's the others that usually prevail. And there are many, many examples that there's the debates of how to deal with the region, what policy to have. Some, they consider both sides, but they usually agree on what I was describing in Griboyedov's case. No, the state knows better, the state will do it and do it quickly and so on.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. My question is, if you have looked at the other side, Georgian side, whether these people considered themselves as colonized at the time and how the identity was negotiated, how the local identity was negotiated with the colonial imperial one?
Very good. Excellent question. Yes, I looked at this question not on Georgian side because I don't study Georgia. I don't know Georgian, and so I wouldn't presume to do this. But this is a critical question when anyone writes about some kind of a history or relations between two different sides. So this is one of my central approach when I wrote several books that dealt with this Russia steppe frontier and people across various Muslim, Turkic peoples. So that what I considered, but not in case of Georgia. But to summarize it, you touched on one of the most critical issues that, again, should be considered within the imperial colonial conquest. The local peoples, various peoples that Russia encountered, for a long time never considered themselves to be the subjects of the Russian Empire, while the Russians considered them to be subjects. That has been an immediate point of misunderstanding first and confrontation. And this is a complex issue because what is involved is issue of translation, mistranslating, deliberately mistranslating documents. Not a terribly new issue because it happened in America and on the Western frontier as well with Native Americans. But in Russia it was done systematically to misrepresent the relationship between Russia and different peoples. So from the point of view of the Russian Tsar, beginning from late 16th century until all the way into the 19th century and 20th, he could never consider others in the East and South to be equal to him. They were all immediately, when the Russians arrived and they discovered these people, they immediately called them, you were the subjects, you were happy to be the subjects of the Russian Tsar. Some people had no idea what a subject is, you know, the relation between the suzerain and a subject. So Suvorov, General Suvorov, yeah, everyone knows General Suvorov. He was stationed in the Caucasus for a short time before he became famous. And he, I quoted in the book that you see here, he writes a report to Petersburg and he says, it makes no sense to call these people subjects. This notion doesn't exist among them. We need to deal with them on differently. But of course, these are ignored. All because St. Petersburg can only deal with them as a suzerain, great Russian Tsar versus a subject. The same was true for the Georgians. The Georgians fell into this category, obviously. Why? You could ask a good question. Why is that, right? A complicated question. Again, very briefly, Russian Tsars and emperors considered themselves, like the Ottoman sultans and Chinese emperors, to be universal monarchs. Russian Tsars considered of Moscow to be the second Jerusalem and the third Rome. You probably heard the idea of a third Rome. The idea of a second Jerusalem is less known, but nonetheless, well, that's what they thought. In 1589, when Russia received the right to call itself Patriarchate, yeah, from Constantinople, from the Patriarch of Constantinople, they immediately write and they complain and they say, our names, you know that there are 4 ancient patriarchies, yeah? Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. So then they mention this 4, and then they mention Moscow. So Moscow Patriarch wrote and said, no, we want to be the second after Constantinople and Jerusalem. We need to be above Antioch and Alexandria. They already were arguing and were unhappy. So it's interesting. Moscow always had this, you know, the expression chip on the shoulder. It means insecurity, which in many ways you can trace to today. Certainly through the Soviet period, always needed to be demanding more than, never satisfied with how much honor and dignity it receives and so on. And always demanding greater respect and so on. So you touched on one of the fundamental kind of issues that I wrote about quite a bit, but I can't go into further detail here, so thank you.